Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Levy. Good morning to all. And thank you to the organizers for this amazing opportunity to be able to present our paper here. So, as you already said, this is a project that I've been developing with my colleague Eckhard Köhler from the Walter Eucken Institute in Freiburg. We call it the Muthesius controversy. This will be explained in a minute, what this means. Well, the project is, broadly speaking, part of my PhD thesis, which I'm currently doing at the University of Freiburg. The thesis is on the Freiburg School of Law and Economics of the 1930s and 1940s. And in particular, the thesis will focus on the role of that the members of the Freiburg School assigned to the state. And we'll hear quite a lot about that today as well. Although the story I want to tell does not take place in the heyday of the Freiburg School, but really much later, and reflecting on the ideals of these economists and lawyers. So what our project does is it analyzes an exchange of letters among the German-speaking members of the Mont Pelerin Society of the year 1955. And since these are all MPS members, I will, first of all, talk briefly about the Mont Pelerin Society. I will then give some background on the German debate that was preceding the antitrust legislation that was eventually then passed in the late 50s. So this is the background you're going to get, and then I'll talk about the sources that we're using, the data, so to speak. This is basically the exchange of letters that is then in the third chapter described in detail. And in the fourth chapter, I'm evaluating basically the two themes of this exchange of letters, which is differing views on competition policies among liberals and the Freiburg School's relationship with National Socialism. How these are connected, I will tell you in a minute. And then I'll have a short conclusion for you. Other than that, I'm fine with you asking questions at any moment. Actually, this might be helpful if something is not entirely clear. Let me also say that all the quotes that you're going to see from the letters and also from some of the literature have been translated from German to English by us, so they may still be not totally understandable to you. Please ask if something should be unclear. Other than that, of course, I can also refer to the paper that you all have for even more details on the things that we've will discuss here. All right, let's get started. Here is the first meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society that took place in 1947. And you can already see some of the main protagonists of my talk here. So there is Hayek presiding over the event as, on the table in the back. And then there on the side are three gentlemen. Basically, they are again photographed in this little picture from another perspective. And as you can see, there is, on the left, there is Mises, then Walter Eucken, and Karl Iverson, I believe. So, Mises, Eucken, and Hayek are going to play a role in what I will discuss. Of course, the Mont Pelerin Society does not need an introduction regarding the audience here. However, I'm just going to say really quickly that the MPS was founded by Friedrich Hayek and a group of liberal intellectuals, both scholars and journalists. Most of these scholars were economists. In 1947, on Mont Pelerin, above Vevey in Switzerland. Their aim was, quote unquote, to contribute to the preservation and improvement of the free society. So, kind of important, given the context here of me talking in the US, these are liberals in the European sense. Well, the Mont Pelerin Society, as you know, during this time, during the late 40s, early 50s, is generally identified as neoliberal. However, this might not actually be true for all of their members, that they felt they were part of the neoliberal community. Because the relationship between market and state was actually highly controversial among the founding members of the MPS. So we have to remember what was meant by neoliberal back then. So one of the first expressions of what neoliberalism could be was the famous speech by Alexander Rüstow at the Verein für Sozialpolitik. This is still the time of the Weimar Republic, right? And he says, well, we need a new liberalism, and that would be a third way between planning and laissez-faire. So that's like one of the first definitions that is given of this new liberal direction. And you can see by the quote given here from Milton Friedman from 1951 that this image, at least partly, is perfectly intact in the early 1950s, right? So the state is still assigned a much different role than it was to be than it used to be. So here's what Friedman says, how he defines neoliberalism. Neoliberalism would accept the 19th century liberal emphasis on the fundamental importance of the individual, but it would substitute for the 19th century goal of laissez-faire as a means to this end the goal of the competitive order. Note that he uses actually the same wording as Walter Eucken, the competitive order. The citizens would be protected against the state by the existence of free private market. Well, this is the same thing goes, of course, for 19th century liberalism, but then they would be protected against each other by the preservation of competition. And this is new. And it cannot be reached by promoting laissez-faire, but rather by promoting what he calls the competitive order. And this is something that not all people in the early MPS could agree with. So there were some classical, quote-unquote, liberals in the MPS that actually thought, well, laissez-faire is kind of a good idea. We want to stick to that. So this tension has been in the MPS from the very beginning, and it can even be traced back way before that to the colloque Walter Lippmann, for example. So these are two lines of thought here in the early MPS concerning what their liberalism is, really. Let me now give you, yeah.
I just wanted to say, right, there's a debate on exactly what is neoliberalism, and I've always kind of looked at it as those institutions, it's liberalism in the classical sense, and then you lay on top the Bretton Woods orders of the World Bank, the IMF, and the WTO, and so you have this new, David disagree, shaking his head, but you put into those institutions, and that's the new order that we have.
I'm not totally disagreeing. Certainly there's an institutional focus that is much stronger, and these institutions in a way qualify for that institutional focus as well, of course. All right, so let me give you another piece of background here. And now we're going to get closer to the controversy that we want to describe. So, the German debate on antitrust legislation. So the competition law of the Federal Republic of Germany was took only effect in 1958, so pretty late, given that the war ended way earlier, right? Before this time, and since the end of the 40s, you had a debate on regulating anti-competitive behavior and how it could be done. And maybe you've heard of one of the most famous proposals from this time is the Joosten draft, which basically proposed a general ban on cartels, and it was influenced heavily by the ordoliberal ideas of the Freiburg School. So in particular, the ideas of Walter Eucken, Franz Böhm, and Eucken's student Leonhard Miksch, who was also very interested in the issue of competition. Well, this was one point of view. And another point of view, a totally different point of view really, was that, well, the necessity of competition policy was just not taken that seriously by other people and questioned, and some felt that this was not needed at all. And an example for this is a new publication that came out in 1955, and it was called Monatsblätter für Freiheitliche Wirtschaftspolitik. Its editor was Volkmar Muthesius. He was a member of the MPS, and he has been called Ludwig Mises' closest German intellectual ally. And we'll see what this means, and that he lives up to his reputation in this regard. Well, the first issue of these Monatsblätter features an article by a journalist called Hans Helwig. He's the only one mentioned here frequently who's not a member of the MPS. And he writes this article in May of 1955, which is entitled, "We Don't Need Antitrust Legislation." It's really short. As you can see, it's only 3 pages, and it's making the following arguments. He says, well, he emphasizes the opposing forces that cartels are exposed to under a regime of free competition. And he says, it is difficult to understand how one could think of making the same state that creates cartels in the first place the guardian of competition. So here you have the classical Austrian argument against competition policy. You're just basically following here in the footsteps of Mises.
What's Helwig's background?
We know really little about him. He was a colleague of Miksch at the Frankfurter Zeitung right before the war. So this is basically the newspaper that was preceding the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. We know they were colleagues. We know he's a die-hard libertarian.
He's not a trained economist.
I suppose he is. I suppose he is.
You say he's a journalist in the paper, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, but he certainly did some economic studies.
Okay.
No.
One issue on this is, what was his age at the time, and there's also a prior issue of what was he doing during the war?
Right, so until the dissolvement of the Frankfurter Zeitung, he was with them, which is I think the early 40s. I'm not sure what he did during the war then. And the age...
He's German, right? He's German.
He is German, yeah, of course. But it's actually, he's not that important. So
there is the issue of his Nazi involvement and so on. What was he?
Helwig, well, no, I don't know.
Because how old, do you have some idea how old he would have been when he wrote the article?
I would, yeah, well, I have his, the date somewhere, but I believe around 50 maybe. Maybe a little younger.
Or it would have been in a full age during...
Yes, of course,
Okay.
for sure, yeah, this is certainly the case. All right, but he's really not that important to our story, as you will see, because he's basically just getting the thing started. Well, we can see how he basically means to say here that competition policy just is interventionism, and the argument is not that controversial, right? You can make this point, and the Austrians have made it time and again. Now, what makes this article interesting is the proof he's using. And I'm also putting this in quotes because it's not an actual proof, I think. So, he says that this can also be seen from the reception of the Freiburg School's ideas on competition policy by the Nazis. Now, this is a strange argument, not only because of the issue of logic, of how these two are connected, but also because Eucken and Böhm were part of the German resistance movement against the Nazis, right? So they participated in the drawing up of a secret memorandum that was commissioned by Dietrich Bonhoeffer at the time of the Confessing Church. And they were actually interrogated in the case of Eucken and arrested in the case of Böhm after the July 20 plot to assassinate Hitler failed. So they were pretty much on the other side of that fence, right? So this makes this argument so curious. But let me just show you the actual paragraph where he makes this connection, and you'll see what he meant. Maybe you'll understand. It's not entirely clear, I suppose. So he says the following. So this is the paragraph where he makes the connection. He says, the ideas of Böhm, Eucken, and Miksch on antitrust policy and on performance competition, Leistungswettbewerb, were allowed to be published unchallenged in the series of the Academy for German Law, edited by Reichsminister Dr. Hans Frank. This certainly does not prove anything against these ideas, but at least something against their liberal substance. The National Socialists had a fine nose for this. And he goes on. Just imagine that the three authors would have brought forward the catalectic cartel theory by von Mises instead of their demand for performance competition secured by the state and supported by the theory of economic systems. What was granted to the doctrine of Leonhard Misch would undoubtedly have been denied to that of Ludwig Mises. Immediately, the National Socialists sensed the interventionist socialist element of this new theory of competition. So this is the connection he's making.
If you want to defer my question, you can.
Sure.
Because this quote is so important. I find this a fascinating paper. One of the issues, you kind of dismissed the role of Hellwig. I'm not sure I agree, because Hayek later on, page 12 of your paper, he says, with respect to the factual matter, I'm probably closer to the position developed by Mr. Hellwig than one attacked by him.
Right.
So one could, and I think one of the things to me your paper brings out is what all the flap was about with Hayek's road to serfdom. But then Hayek goes on to say, this has nothing to do with the style of the attack against Eucken and so on. I would get this all the more since the use of such insinuations only weaken the factual arguments. And I frankly have to say, it strikes one that there's a certain element of hypocrisy in Hayek raising issues about the tone, given the author of the book titled The Road to Serfdom. And I think this presumably was a lot of what the plaque was about Hayek's road to serfdom among a lot of interventionists. This sort of.
It's an interesting comment. Yeah, you're right. One thing.
This quote is important because Hayek is raising this issue about the tone, and so it raises the issue of what was, given what Hayek has written in this book titled The Road to Serfdom, what did he view as sort of over the line, given that he, in some ways, agrees with the substance of the argument that Hellwig is making?
Right, and by the tone he means basically the whole National Socialism analogy that is made here. So this is meant by tone by him, right? At least I suppose. One other thing about Hellwig that I can say is that he was corresponding with Mises for a longer time after that. So if you know the very, very extensive biography of Hülsmann of Mises, he quotes some Hellwig correspondence in there. So this might maybe help.
Since the road to serfdom has been brought up, no, this is one of the things that is missing in Bruce's Caldwell's edition is filling in the German authors that Hayek prudentially omitted, right? Because in the reading list, he has American authors, Henry Simons, he has British authors, but he says there are German authors who would be edifying, but for obvious prudential reasons they are omitted.
Right.
And in Bruce's edition, that list is not filled in. One can guess there's going to be Eucken and there's going to be other, but
definitely.
But given he's got Simons in, he's got Simons in, and his blurb. I actually have a copy of the dust jacket of Simons' book with a blurb from Hayek on it.
I know. I mean, Hayek and Eucken also, they were acquainted way before the war, so they knew each other.
So the Hayek's opinion, so what Hayek is looking at is real liberalism and road to serfdom. We know the American, in English, we know the English language stuff.
Yeah.
But we don't know the German language stuff because Hayek was worried about that would be a death sentence if that list was there.
Yeah, good point.
The secret police knows how to read English, right?
And then you're saying because Road to Serfdom has come out during the war.
Yeah,
the war's
right.
not over with yet.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
The Road to Serfdom came out during the war. I mean, if he put a list of people of their friends, that's a death sentence.
Yeah, it could have been. I'm sure.
And so
They would have looked at that, certainly.
Bruce's edition doesn't attempt to parse that list, say who would have been in it, save for these prudential reasons.
No, it would have put them in danger, for sure. Actually, we have a similar issue later in the presentation, where Röpke is also basically in a review of the volume that is talked about here, saying that, well, this is an attack on National Socialism, and he's saying this in 1942, and I believe that Eucken and his colleagues weren't weren't enthused by that, right? Because they felt that this was dangerous to point out. Röpke was in Switzerland at the time, so he couldn't care less, of course, but he put possibly his friends in danger by saying that this was an attack on National Socialism. We'll see that later.
Yeah.
So similar issue, right?
Yeah, you're right.
All right, so this is the quote that kind of starts it all. Just to make this one quick point, because the issue has been mentioned, performance competition is something that is maybe not readily understood. So the Freiburg School differentiates between two kinds of competition. First, performance competition, competition on merits, which is what we think is competition, and then prevention competition, which is basically all competitive strategies that aim at hindering competition. So a cartel would also be considered, in the context of the Freiburg School, a competitive strategy, but one that wants to basically get rid of competition. So this distinction is important. All right, so let me talk about the sources real quick. So this is what these letters look like that we have looked at. This is the one from Hayek to Muthesius. Fortunately, they were all typed, or most of them were typed, so I didn't have to read much handwriting.
Is this the first, I'm ignoramus, is this the first time that these two competing ideas were set off against each other, or have there been an earlier round?
Which two ideas?
Well, I guess the liberal antitrust theory that says don't do anything, and the other one that says you need the state to intervene. I mean,
You mean in the Germans?
I imagine that there's a kind of American pre-version of it in the early 20th century. So.
Of course. I mean, in a way, the Freiburg School's arguments mirror much of what was going on in old Chicago, right?
Yes, I'm just curious. I haven't read your paper. Is what's going to follow? Are we interested primarily because of the merits of the arguments are going to be new, or are we interested in the sociology of these two groups who ought to be allies?
I think it's not entirely new. It's really something that's just has been going on for a long time, right? So since the beginning of neoliberalism, I think these two ideas have basically, because competition has always been a very important idea for neoliberals, right? Simons also emphasized this very, very much. So this is it's kind of just a variation on something that is extremely similar to other things that have been going on. All right, so the exchange of letters, these are the protagonists, the main protagonists of this exchange. So there's Edith Eucken, who is the widow of Walter Eucken. Walter Eucken died in 1950, and his wife kept corresponding with his colleagues and old friends. Then there are Wilhelm Röpke and Alexander Rüstow. So we have heard of Rüstow before, right? He was one of the early advocates of neoliberalism. They are both considered to be autoliberals. However, they left Germany right after the Nazis took power in 1933. They went to Turkey, to Istanbul, and so they're not part of the Freiburg School, which only emerged after that, basically. But they're today referred to as sociological liberalism because they had an even broader interest in other areas, say, of the study of human nature and of history. So they are related to the ideas of Eucken and Böhm, but are not considered to be part of the same subgroup of autoliberalism, if you want. Okay, so then there is Ludwig Mises, who is actually also taking part in this discussion, who is in New York at the time, and Hayek, who is in Chicago. So these are the main protagonists of our correspondence. So there are 28 individual letters. They have been donated to the Walter Eucken Institute by Eucken Erzsieg, at least we believe that is the case.
Who or what was Eucken? Was that
his wife.
His wife, okay.
His late wife. So she's not. She's not living anymore. But it's just. The letters are in this folder, and it's labeled as, I believe, Hellwig conversation or something, and it contains all the letters and has been put together by her, but it hasn't been worked on until we started doing this last year. So it has just been sitting at the Institute for a long time, we believe. All right, so these letters were written between May 3rd and July 4th of 1955. We believe that most of them are actually totally unknown. In the case of the Mises correspondence, Hülsmann has the Mises letters also analyzed, so he knows the Muthesius conversation of Mises. But other than that, it hasn't been mentioned in the literature. So at least not these letters. So the controversy is kind of well known because Böhm wrote an article about it in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, which I will also quote. But the details are really only provided by us now. All right, so the topics of this exchange of letters are these two things that Helvig, with his quote-unquote proof, connects. So first, competition policy, obviously, and then the portrayal of Eucken, Böhm, and Miksch as Rüstow has says, as collaborators of National Socialism. So this is what Rüstow makes of Helvig's argument. Okay, so here's the exchange of letters. It's way longer in the paper, of course. I'm just showing you some highlights from the correspondence. So, on May 3rd, Carlo Mötterli, who is a journalist with the Neue Zürcher Zeitung in Zurich, right? He writes to Muthesius and says he will no longer contribute to the Monatsblätter because Helvig's article is an inexcusable faux pas. Apparently, Muthesius thinks about whether, how did this come about? What is the reason that Mötterli is saying this? And he asks Eucken, Erzig, and Röpke for their opinion and sends them the first issue of the Monatsblätter and basically asks, what do you think of that? Is that something that, do you see anything particular strange in here, right? And Röpke answers him and he says, well, whatever Helvig thinks about cartels and antitrust policy, he should never have resorted to this lowly denunciation. And he suggests that Muthesius must have overlooked Helvig's offense in a moment of distraction. And he says that he expects an act of active regret. He expects basically that Muthesius admits his mistake in the next issue of the Monatsblätter. So he's very specific about that. However, it seems that this was not, in fact, a moment of distraction, but that they actually, both Helvig and Muthesius, meant what was written there. You can tell this from the letter that Helvig writes to his editor a couple of days later, where he basically explains his rationale. And he says, the whole point is that those works were allowed to be published, although the authors were frowned upon by the authorities. But they, the authorities, liked the thought of a governmental organization of the economy so much that they gladly ignored the remaining views of the authors. So, and he goes on. I like this quote in particular. I understand that the autoliberals are uncomfortable with the fact that all three appearances of socialism, the democratic as well as the communist and the national socialist, appreciate a governmental organization of competition. So look, I mean, who is all a socialist here? So obviously communists are socialists, national socialists are socialists, but also social democrats. So social democrats are also socialists. So it reminds me of this quote by Mises, right? Yeah, you're all a bunch of socialists. I mean, this is basically saying the same thing, right? Even the social democrats are socialists. It's hard to argue with the two other groups, of course. But still, it's a very comprehensive notion of what socialism entails. And he says the following, so he's very, very clear about this. The notion that a neoliberal concept of competition did not find favor with the rulers of the Third Reich is based on factual error. So it couldn't be more clear. He really believes that the Nazis did not like cartels. So the next day, Muthesius takes this letter that he has received from Helvig, and he sends it on to Eucken, Erzig, Röpke, and Rüstow. And he says, regarding the factual matter, I lean towards the view of Ludwig von Mises. In this point, I definitely agree with Hans Helvig. And he attaches the letter. And then the three people are answering. So Röpke says to Muthesius, the division of our circle in this matter, and the cartel problem, has always been a burden, and one had always to assume that tempers would collide. And he urges Muthesius again to distance himself from the allegation made by Helwig. Now, Eugen Erzig it's not very critical with him really, but just appeals to him here and says it is only a small circle of people for whom freedom is a genuine concern. You're part of it, Mr. Muthesius, but so are all the others involved in this matter. And she asked Muthesius to declare publicly that it was out of the question to deny the representatives of order liberalism their liberal disposition. So Rüstow is probably the most critical because he writes the following. He says he believes that Helwig denounces Eugen, Miksch, and Böhm as collaborators of National Socialism, and he takes offense at the treacherous way in which historical facts are presented to verify this claim. And then he basically offers his own opinion of how the volume of the Academy of German Law came about. He says, in actual fact, the volume was a cuckoo's egg that the neoliberal Freiburg Circle succeeded in planting into the National Socialist series, therefore an act of intellectual sabotage against National Socialism. So pretty much the opposite of what Helwig is saying here, right? Now, Mises weighs in on May 18, and it's kind of interesting that he is pretty quick to jump to the conclusion that Helwig's accusation is a statement of facts. And then he says the following: it is simply true that he who advocates any kind of interventionist measures places himself in this regard in a circle that appears quite undesirable to him. But he ends on this kind of conciliatory note when he says the upright demeanor that was proven by Böhm, Eugen, and Miksch in the years of Nazi rule has always filled me with admiration. Still, he takes Helwig's side in this, right? And then Hayek. Hayek's letter is the last one that arrives. And he says, well, as has been quoted before, that is, the remark is a serious offense against the principles of decent discussion. And then, as you know, I'm probably closer to the position developed by Mr. Helwig, but this has nothing to do with the style of the attack against Eugen, Miksch, and Böhm. And he says he regrets this all the more since the use of such a style of insinuations only weakens the factual arguments.
When he says the position developed by Mr. Helwig, does he mean strictly on the antitrust case or also on the, let's call it, credentialness of publishing in a Nazi series?
Well, I think what he means by the style of the attack is the whole Nazi issue, right? So I believe Hayek disagrees with the view on competition policy.
Yeah, but maybe I'm too philosophical, but I think there are actually two substantial issues. One is position, and the other is when under dictatorship, do you publish in public journals? And it strikes me that that's a non-trivial issue. Given David's question earlier about what you say and don't say in times of war,
right.
It's possible that Hayek has a more subtle issue.
Well, I see the distinction you're making. It's just hard to tell from the letter that Hayek sends here. But it's an interesting point, of course. We'll talk about the background, how this volume came about in a moment. But it's certainly an issue we should keep in mind, of course. Okay, so what I will now do is basically evaluate the points that are made in the exchange of letters. First of all, the views on competition policy that are expressed here throughout the discussion, and then also the issue of the volume. So, first of all, there are two competing views on competition policy here, right? So one is the ordoliberal view. In this view, competition is seen as the antidote to what they call private economic power. So private economic power would be the ability to dictate prices or terms of a transaction. And they believe that competition can solve this problem, also something that is similar, of course, to Simons, to Knight, to all the people in the 30s who worried about the issue of economic power. The state, well, the solution to this problem is seen in basically the state providing an institutional framework for competition, in which then certain competitive strategies are just not permissible. So this is the prevention competition side of things. And the criterion to distinguish between prevention competition and, competition on merits is just that of consumer sovereignty. Böhm made that very clear in an early article of 1933. So this is how we can tell them apart. And then there is the free market liberalism, as I would like to call them. And this is something that I've taken from Mr. Funberg. Sorry?
How important is the fact that, if I understand it correctly, that German civil law requires all contracts to be enforced, including contracts for cartel?
Yeah, this is an issue. So at the very end of the 19th century, there was actually a law passed that would enforce cartel contracts. And this led to the fact that Germany was at one point known as the land of cartels, because they just grew massive. And this was even speeded up in the Weimar Republic, although they passed a new legislation on cartels, but it didn't. I don't think they were enforceable, these contracts, anymore, but still it didn't stop this development. So yeah, this has been really instrumental in basically getting much of the German industry of the very late 19th century cartelized. And I mean, this is one of the issues that got started the whole movement of the Freiburg School, that they felt that these positions of power were just too much and that it would hurt consumers in such a meaningful way. So this is important.
But the fact that government preventions, the state preventions, or constitution about those kinds of contracts was insufficient, therefore liberalism recommends a constitution over economic matters, which is in some way distinct, correct?
Distinct from what?
From the constraints on state. They also asked for constraints on markets. Maybe
Well, in this very, very general sense that they should be constrained by a framework of rules, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So the distinction is always between basically moving freely within rules, but then having rules that ensure that this interaction there is beneficial to the society as a whole. That's the idea, the basic idea. All right, so so the ordoliberal idea I just described, and now free market liberalism is basically what Mises advocates here. I'm taking, as I said, the expression from Victor Funberg. You could also, of course, just refer to the Austrians here. The imperative is that of laissez-faire. There is implicitly an institutional framework, I believe, needed for this even to work on a very modest level, but it's not explicited by Mises. He basically never followed Eucken in this distinction between talking about the rules of markets and, intervention on markets themselves. So for him, it's kind of the same thing. He doesn't spend too much time describing the difference between institutional framework and then intervention on markets and in-market behavior, kind of inside this game. So he, in his book on liberalism, for example, he says, in the unhampered development of the economy, there is no tendency towards the exclusion of competition. So in the absence of competition policy, competition works just fine. And he says something similar in the in Human Action, where he basically says, under a regime of laissez-faire, economic power only rests in the hands of the consumers. So that is the kind of the opposite of what Eucken believes.
Maybe it's in your next slide, but isn't there a component of the argument that I think is important, overlaps with the later Chicago School, that there's also the element that if you have the government getting involved in competition thing, no way you're going to trust the government.
Yeah, this is the argument that Helvig was making earlier.
So you're going back to the Adam Smith quote. There's no way you're going to trust the government to do anything any better. There's a presumption you're going to make things worse.
Yeah, I mean, this is the Austrian view, of course, and I mean, the Freiburg School certainly was aware of this dilemma, but they also felt that a quote-unquote free market would just evolve into basically a market with positions of economic power.
But that we brought out as a further bullet point, this idea that any alternative to just sort of unhampered development involving the government, it's just going to make things worse because of the abuses of government, the abuses of power involved. I thought that's an important component of von Mises' argument, and it's...
Yeah, it was on the other slide made by Helvig, right? So I didn't think I should repeat that. But yeah, of course, it's an important part.
Yeah, so in human action, Mises' position on monopoly is actually a little bit more nuanced. So he admits that there are cases of monopolies.
Yeah, he does.
He just thinks that they're not very prevalent. So it's really not necessary to address those few issues.
Exactly. So he says monopoly prices are possible if there's a natural resource, but I mean, the main idea here is that private actors cannot just try to exclude competition. That is the main idea. That this will, in a dynamic perspective, fail.
It's been a while since I read this, but doesn't Mises also depend very much on complete and total free trade? So what's the slogan? The tariff is the mother of monopoly, or something like this. And so that if you have monopolies, and that's going to create incentives to entry from outside the country, and as long as you got free tariffs,
Right.
It just occurred to me, given all these here, that suggests that if you can't get rid of tariffs, you can defend ordoliberalism as second best.
Actually, this is done in the exchange of letters. This comes up. No, this comes up. This issue that they are saying, well, if I don't know who's making this point. I believe Röpke is making the point that, well, I would agree with the Austrian side if we could just have all tariffs banned, then it would work. He's saying something to this effect. So yeah.
How wonderful is that?
I should maybe include this in the paper.
Yeah, because that's a clean second best argument.
Yeah, no, it is. That's true. Thanks for pointing that out.
Sorry to that. Where did that phrase, free market liberalism, where did you get that from?
As I said, this is a quote, a term that Victor Vanberg is using. Victor Vanberg is comparing here constitutional liberalism, ordoliberalism, to what he calls free market liberalism, and it's just basically he's meaning the Austrians.
In what year? When did he coin that phrase? I've seen it.
I think in the late 90s, 98 or so. I mean, yeah, you can basically exchange that for Austrians in this case.
I will just push David's question a little bit. Was there an awareness that if you can't get rid of all tariffs, but you got rid of some tariffs, that would make things worse?
Huh. And it's not mentioned in the exchange of letters?
That's where the bite is. That, if there are 15 distortions, removing 7 of them doesn't help. It makes it worse.
Right.
And it was a standard quip which Joseph Stiglitz would always use when I was a graduate student. Chicago never seems to understand this.
Ah, okay. So it only works if you remove all tariffs.
That's
yeah.
right. And then
Right.
you have this whole thrust in international trade theory of a particular period where this whole the Harry Johnson, Bhagwati theory of distortions were pursued.
No, and this is certainly what Mises wanted, definitely. But it seemed, apparently it wasn't realistic at the time, or it seemed to Röpke, or whoever said it, that it was just not realistic to get rid of tariffs. I thought that was interesting, because from today's perspective, tariffs are not that much of an issue anymore, right? But it used to be that they felt that this was something that could never be dissolved in the 50s. So, I mean, of course, tariffs play some role, but other things that prevent trade are, I guess, more important today, right? Regulations. All right. But now let's talk about the volume, the 1942 volume. Let me give you some background on this. This is the title of the volume, and you can tell that it was edited by, that it came out during the Nazi time, right? It says competition as a means of boosting economic performance and selection. And Schmölders was the editor back then. The volume was produced by the so-called Group 4 of the Academy of German Law. That was just the working group on economics of the Academy. It was fairly short-lived. It was established in 1940 and was closed again in 1943 because it was, quote-unquote, not vital to the war effort. It should be mentioned that several of the members of this Group 4 later on, after 1943, formed what they called the Arbeitsgemeinschaft Erwin von Beckerath. This is also a working group on economics, and they had close ties to the German opposition as well, in particular to the Kreisau Circle. So this Arbeitsgemeinschaft Erwin von Beckerath also includes Eucken and Böhm, so they were members of several oppositional groups. So this is what the Group 4 eventually evolved into after being closed by the Nazis. So this is the actual content of that volume, the three texts by these authors that were mentioned. So Eucken basically shows in his paper that the wartime economic system, that is dominated by elements of central planning. And he proposes basically the establishment of an economic constitution that upholds the rules of performance competition. And Böhm and Mick just underline this point by, here, Böhm is saying, well, he's elaborating a little bit on the incompatibility of central planning and competition, and Mick is talking about the regulation of imperfect competition. So this is the content of this volume. There are, of course, other authors in this as well, but this is what the Freiburg School economists are saying. Well, Böhm was a lawyer, but you get the idea. Okay. So this is the interpretation that the exchange of letters offers to us, right? So Helwig says the whole point is that those works are allowed. So obviously the authorities like the thought of a governmental organization of the economy so much that they gladly ignored the other views of the authors. This is one position, and Rusto is saying the opposite. He's saying, well, in actual fact, the volume was really an act of intellectual sabotage against National Socialism. So these are the kind of opposing views we get from the exchange of letters. What are some other interpretations of that book? For example, I mentioned earlier that Böhm wrote an answer to Helwig's article very shortly after that came out. So in May 1955, he wrote this article in the Frankfurter Allgemeine where he commented on this particular Helwig article, right? And he says, why could such a conference take place in the Third Reich, and how was it possible that those presentations were published in the official series? The answer is simple, because the National Socialists had only contempt for the whole of economics and because they were completely indifferent to the writing and thinking of German economists. So this is his explanation of how this could have come about. This is the review from Röpke, which I mentioned earlier. So he is in Switzerland at the time. He has come back from Istanbul to Switzerland, and he reviews the book for the NZZ. And as I believe that his colleagues back in Germany were not pleased with the way he's describing the volume here, because he's saying this is a blatant denunciation of the complete fiasco of National Socialist war on command economy. Certainly didn't help the reputation of the Freiburg School with the Nazis. And then there is Schmölders. Schmölders, the editor of this volume, right, who went on to be an important economist also in post-war Germany. And he, in 1980, reflecting on this volume, says something similar to Rusto. He says it was basically an act of subversion. He makes a point of how they basically just chose the title to appease the authorities and how difficult it was to work under these conditions, and he's really making it a kind of an active act of opposition. Well, how can we reconcile these very, very different views? Let me say first something about the argument that Schmölders is making and that Rusto is also making, so the idea of an act of intellectual sabotage or subversion. I think probably the view taken by the German historian Jansen is, I guess, the most plausible to me here. So he says, well, the ordoliberal concept of competition was not opposed to National Socialist ideology as such. And this is just because they viewed competition, at least in theory, as selection in the market. So it fits with the social Darwinist ideas of the Nazis to talk about competition. In practice, they weren't such great fans of competition. But in theory, they liked the idea that this selection process would actually lead to higher outcomes, higher production volumes. So this, to me, kind of explains why you could write such a book during this time. But it also means, of course, that this is not an act of subversion, because you're saying something that fits with this ideology.
Were the papers addressing themselves to the wartime situation, or were they addressing themselves to what might happen after the war was over? Because it strikes me that you could make an exception under wartime, and then...
Yeah, well, Eucken was talking about the wartime economic system, yeah. But he was developing the other idea, the economic constitution, for a post-war world.
And so it strikes me that the real issue is to what degree that claim is going to be compatible with ideology.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's kind of something that is hard to speculate on what would have happened if there would have been a post-war Nazi economy, right?
Were the Nazis themselves not preparing for final victory?
For what?
For final victory. They in no moment thought, we'll do it.
There's a little bit of a discussion about whether maybe in a new world order by the Nazis they would have allowed for more competition or a market-like structure after they could get rid of the wartime measures, right? So some historians are claiming this, but I mean, we don't know, right?
I have extremely little sympathy for the Helwig position, but it strikes me that Eucken is playing an extremely dangerous game here by kind of imagining what the world would look like.
Well, I mean,
at the end of war.
Everybody was sure that the war would end eventually. It's just the question of basically who won, right? So
I think there's an important issue here with the phrases elements of central planning, because my understanding is that National Socialism compared to communism still allows a role for market prices.
I'm going to say something about this in a minute.
You could call it the respect for selection mechanism. They do value performance as measured by sort of market prices.
Definitely.
They don't propose getting rid of market prices. I think I'm not sure what the deal was during the height of the war command economy.
Actually, they got rid of many market prices in 1936 already. So in preparation for the war, pretty early on, they did not allow prices to flow freely anymore. But can you do it afterwards?
No, in this context, I mean, didn't the management of the world economy by Nazi change at a certain point? So they reinstalled a certain amount of freedom of production after 1942. Because it was such a failure.
I'll say something about this in a minute, how they did this. Okay, yeah, I'm seeing the sign, thanks. All right, so so basically I'm taking the position here, this is not an act of subversion, it is not an act of intellectual sabotage. Still, Jansen is also saying this was a devastating rejection of the system of economic planning that had progressively been established with the war economy. So this is clear. It was not, in all likelihood, though, an act of subversion. As I said, to me, this explains why this could have been published at all, right? But now to Helwig's argument. And it's just really important to note that there are very few similarities between the ordoliberal concept of competition policy and the quote-unquote competition policy of National Socialism. So just to give you a couple of examples what they actually did concerning cartels. So in 1933 already, they strengthened the old cartel system of the Weimar Republic and also enabled compulsory cartelization. Then between 33 and 36, the Ministry of Economic Affairs oversaw the formation of 1,600 voluntary cartels and imposes another 120 compulsory cartel agreements. So these numbers are taken from the book by Tooze, Wages of Destruction. And I think that is staggering. So the Nazis actually really like cartels.
Oh, I just thought you were talking about the New Deal in the United States. That's how you mentioned it.
Thank you for our ideological moment.
Well, so this is Nazi Germany creating many cartels. And why did they do this? Well, basically, it seems that this has been a preparation for their variant of planning. Because after 1936, when they began to prepare for war, the business groups, the Wirtschaftsgruppen, which are basically acting, they're compulsory organizations that for a certain branch of industry, and they acted as a link between the Ministry of Economic Affairs and the businesses. And they were given control over the cartels. So basically this economic concentration that they fostered early on was just their mean of planning, right? They used the cartels to conduct their variant of planning. And I think Franz Neumann characterized this very early on in 1944 in a very precise way, what they did here. He calls the Nazi economy totalitarian monopoly capitalism. So it's a monopolistic economic system and a command economy at the same time. It's kind of the worst of both worlds here. And of course, this is pretty much the opposite of Eugen's competitive order. So much for what the Nazis actually did. Well, given that they seemed not really to have much of a beef with cartels, how can we then explain Helwig's insinuations? How can we make sense of that? And well, our proposal here is that this controversy is not really concerned with history. So we believe that Helwig and Muthesius really failed to prove that the Nazis were actually sympathetic to the ordoliberal concept of competition. At no point they provide any evidence for that whatsoever. They're just basically repeating the points you've heard. However, this quote here from Muthesius is kind of telling what at least their position here is. So he says in the letter to Röpke on May 14, "Yet I do not give up hope that you understand what this is all about, namely to keep liberalism from straying into interventionism." So this is the real issue they're trying to get at here with these historical allusions. So our proposal is, well, Helwig and Muthesius basically are defending a specific understanding of the liberal ideal, namely that coercion is the only alternative to laissez-faire. You can see this in Muthesius, in the Mises' letter to Muthesius as well, right? He says, "It is simply true that he who advocates any kind of interventionist measures places himself in this regard in a circle that appears quite undesirable to him." And in another context, in Human Action again, he says, "Laissez-faire means let the common man choose and act, do not force to yield him to a dictator." So they're making this juxtaposition here of coercion and laissez-faire. And this, I believe, offers some explanation, because if we really believe, if we believe that any kind of intervention whatsoever in the market process, even if that is an intervention on the level of rules, as Eugen was supposing, right? If we believe that any kind of intervention is basically a restriction on individual freedom, then the Freiburg School insistence on competition policy is in a way complementary to the Nazi dictatorship. So if we take this extreme view, it makes sense in a way, but it seems still extremely wrong, or at least, well, it's just a little too much, right? And so to conclude, we believe that our exchange of letters basically just mirrors this very old division between 19th century liberalism and the neoliberals. So two concepts of liberalism, one that says, well, all state authority is basically suppression, and another that emphasizes the positive tasks of government in creating and maintaining a functioning market economy. So these, this differentiation seems to pop up again, and it seems to provide some explanation, at least, for Helwig's comments. So, thank you very much.
Let me start by saying something I should have said before, and that is when Sandra and I were talking to Buchanan about things we should have here and things we should call attention to, the one thing he said we should do is to have a lot of stuff on ordoliberals. And I think you sort of see, okay, we got, I obviously let it run because there was lots and lots of discussion. Yeah, okay.
I'm interested in Hayek's position in this. I found the letter that you cited sort of odd. The Road to Serfdom, to me, is a book that's more moral liberal than free market liberal. Yet by 51, he seems to be more free market liberal. Something happened in the intervening time.
Well, I believe a case can be made that the Hayek of the 1940s in particular and the early 1950s is pretty ordoliberal. So you can say this, see this, for example, also in the first speech in front of the MPS, where he basically takes an ordoliberal position on a competitive order and so on and so on. But this changes over time, of course. And I mean, Stefan here has written a paper on Hayek as an ordoliberal and the difficult role that he plays, really. So he seems, I mean, I've actually talked not so much about Hayek because he has a difficult role in this, this whole issue. Mises is pretty easy to pin down in one position, while Hayek, it seems, is somewhere in between. So I agree with you, absolutely.
Yes, I do more so. So I think there is really, Hayek is, as you say, an ambiguous person, but this also makes him interesting at that time. I would just briefly like to read a quote from the same meeting you were mentioning yesterday at IFA in 1947. So, especially in this area, creating the conditions for effective competition, already before the war, a number of important studies were published in Germany, primarily owing to the impulses of Professor Walter Oelke in Freiburg and Professor Franz Blumenau in Frankfurt. The problem of the orderly economy, in the sense in which these scholars have addressed it and have attempted to sketch its solution, is one of the most important tasks the human mind can pose itself today, and the solution which is of immense importance. So I also pretty much agree with what Daniel said, that the Road to Serfdom also inclusive books in the late 1930s, and also, of course, large parts of the Constitution of Liberty have a distinct more liberal touch. And it might be that it is a century order, which is the twist, starting thinking on emergent economy as opposed to this type of reason. So I think, in a way, links to what Paul said yesterday. And just very briefly, on the issue of power, because power in monopolies, I think although liberals have a little bit more, a more complex understanding of power, the issue is not that monopolies as such are bad and by their power they exploit consumers, but that basically they can capture the state, and then after capturing the state will start intervening in the market, and so this will be the interventionist spiral, and that's why we should preclude, for example, by general rules and the state being checked by civil society. So it's not that it's about the power of monopolies in the economic market, but it's a political economic concept of power.
points. And the first one is a question to you, Stefan, and anybody else here. There is a literature on the post-World War II global antitrust movement that makes a point that basically you got nudges, so to say, on the American side to have implemented antitrust regulation in Europe, precisely for what you mentioned before. I mean, this perception that somehow cartels were intrinsic to dictatorship or a totalitarian economy. Now, is there any overlap of that with more recent study on ordoliberalism? Because, of course, if that was the case, ordoliberalism will become tremendously expedient in a way. So you know you're going to be pushed in some direction, and it's much better if you do try to design the institutional infrastructure. And the second point is clear a critical note. I'm a bit uneasy by your conclusion, because I think you're kind of trying to be the Mutesius of the other side. So you're pointing there, you say this thesis doesn't hold. This thesis was advocated by an apparently bad guy, and when you say, you don't agree with me, you're a Nazi. Therefore, I mean, this is not, an idea a good, willing, intellectually honest person should uphold. So now I just wanted to tell you that you do not necessarily need to be crazily sectarian to be a libertarian. He helps, but it's not
No, you don't. I mean, actually, today, even people who consider themselves ordoliberals would have a little different perspective on the dangers of economic power. We have learned since then a lot about, right, how dynamic markets can solve these problems if there's a possibility of competition at least. And so they are also, the ordoliberals were extreme in that they wanted to ensure this kind of competition. Maybe there is some reasonable middle ground here. So I agree with you, and I don't want to be the Mutesius of the other side, really. I just don't personally see another explanation for Helweg's argument, since it seems to me that the Nazis were actually quite fond of cartels, which he believes they were not. So there must be some explanation about that, right?
So I really think it's a fantastic paper, and
thanks.
We now have a 5 to 10 year development of ordoliberal thought here at the Summer Institute, and I think it's really been extremely important to my own intellectual development. In the 30s, Carnap and Heidegger had a famous series of debates, and one way to understand that led sort of to the split between analytic and continental philosophy. Now, one way to understand those debates is to understand them as the nature of responsible speech. That involves a lot of issues. One thing that's striking, and I'm also looking forward to Hayek's further development, so I'll put it like this: Mises, in a way, he interprets responsible speech as you always say the truth, no matter what you think the effects are. I think for a lot of other people that isn't so responsible, but his position is very clear. For many others, including for Carnap and Heidegger, responsible speeches will involve multi-layers of judgment, depending on context, depending on the audience, depending on the esotericism of the message, how technical is it. And what's striking about the Helweg attack is that he has a Misesian understanding of what responsible speech is. But what I also find equally striking is when you listen to the responses by the ordoliberals, their suggestions don't seem particularly subtle about what this 1943 volume really was about and the context. So, and also looking forward to Hayek's own career, it's not clear that they really developed a notion of what responsible speech might be like. So I'm wondering, do you think there's any place in the group? I mean, and also Röpke's review, definitely not responsible speech, right? So I mean, so I think it goes in many ways in which you can think about So, did the community ever develop a doctrine on this or develop a second-order reflection on these issues? Or are they primarily, from this vantage point, interesting because they blunder into this issue time and again? Or do we find a second-order development? I hope that was clear.
Yeah, this is interesting, of course, to kind of analyze the style. And I absolutely concur with you that actually the order liberals in this conversation, so Röpke, Rüstow, and Eugen Erzig in particular, I mean, they're very, this is in the paper, but they're making very strong demands for correction. And they are saying, well, now that we have explained to you that this was intellectual sabotage, you should say this. And I think this is also not a very subtle form, as you said, of communicating, right? This is kind of, it almost feels extortionist in a way.
Who actually owns the Monadblatt? Who was the financier of that? So that was a kind of second question, because there are all these demands, and I'm kind of wondering who's in charge here ultimately.
Well, I think Muthesius at this point, and they have a publisher, obviously, which is a firm in Frankfurt.
Okay, so not connected to the parties in another way.
No, that isn't the case. I think later on, I believe that at some point, Muthesius and Helwig, for their journalistic enterprise, took money from larger firms. But this is actually in the 60s or so.
That actually doesn't.
Yeah, it's later. So it's later that they very clearly take money from some larger German industry, and the Spiegel, a German periodical, points that out when one of their enterprises is actually shattered because they were running out of readers, basically. Were not making any money. Then the industry kind of stepped in at the last minute, but they couldn't save the newspaper. I believe that, but that's another journal that they were working on.
Okay, this is optimization subject to inequality constraints. So George has the last question.
It's a really quick comment. As I've gotten older, I've become more suspicious and more worried about the specter of the Gulag or the specter of National Socialism as a trope in social science debates. I have no idea that strategy, if I followed it, that this strategy emerged while National Socialism was still an immediate presence, and let alone some distant threat. So it was fascinating for me to learn that from you.
Yeah, I think so too. It's kind of amazing that they used these arguments so early on. I mean, calling someone a Nazi today, it seems kind of the same thing back then. And although they were so immediately affected by this, all these people.
Okay, the inequality constraint doesn't have a bound. So,
thank you so much.